The ASCEND-4 trial was a randomized clinical trial of ceritinib versus standard chemotherapy. In this case, that standard chemotherapy was carboplatin or cisplatin with pemetrexed, followed by maintenance pemetrexed, so a very commonly administered chemotherapy regimen for our lung adenocarcinoma patients. It was randomized 1-to-1, approximately 350 or so patients. The patient population, I think, was very representative of what we would expect from our ALK-positive patients. So you had to be ALK-positive to be enrolled in the study. About a third of the patients, roughly 30%, had brain metastasis at baseline, and unfortunately that's a common feature for ALK-positive non-small cell lung cancer and really other types of non-small cell lung cancer as well. And the reason that's important, of course, is because we know it's important to control brain metastases as well as metastases that may occur in the lung, liver, bones, and other places. And so understanding how these drugs work in patients with brain metastases at baseline is a really important factor. Of the patients who were treated in this trial, about half of the patients with brain metastases were previously treated with radiation to the brain, as that's another standard therapy that we use to control brain metastases. The outcome of the trial, I think, was somewhat expected based on prior clinical trials. Ceritinib was clearly superior to chemotherapy. The response rate, for example, was approximately 72% for patients who received ceritinib, and only approximately 30% for patients who received the standard of care chemotherapy. Importantly, that disease control was long-lived. So in the patients who received ceritinib, the progression-free survival was just over 16 months, whereas with chemotherapy, it was only about 8 months. So patients not only had a better chance of tumor shrinkage and control, but also had much longer duration of therapy before their tumors progressed and they needed to move on to a different therapy. Another critical sub-finding of this clinical trial was that the patients who had brain metastases typically did worse. And that's common. Even though ceritinib was shown to be effective in the brain, the progression-free survival was a lot shorter in patients who had brain metastases at baseline, only about 10 months versus 26 months for those who didn't have brain metastases. We saw a much less impactful trend for brain metastases on chemotherapy. Patients who had brain metastases at baseline had a progression-free survival in the range of about 6 months. Those without brain metastasis had 8 months. So it didn't impact chemotherapy as much, but for both groups it was significantly shorter. Other critical aspects that were evaluated in the study were the response rate in the brain, and there again we saw good activity in the brain, meaning that ceritinib demonstrated a response rate of about 72%, very similar to what we saw for the extra CNS response rate or the systemic response rate, suggesting that the drug does have very good CNS penetration or brain penetration. Patients who received chemotherapy also had a similar response rate in the sense that the response rate was only about 27% in the brain and similar to what it was for the systemic response rate. It's notable that the dosing regimen used in ASCEND-4 was the 750 milligrams daily. And that dose has now been associated with far more significant GI side effects, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. And then I think most people who are administering this drug now use the 450 milligrams per day with food, which significantly improves the toxicity profile and side effects that are experienced with this ALK tyrosine kinase inhibitor.
Ceritinib is a fantastic drug. It proved its worth in a second-line setting, and it's proven its worth over crizotinib in a first-line setting. The dilemma with ceritinib, I think, has come down to some of the tolerability issues, and so it got approved initially at a dose that probably was a little too high in terms of causing side effects for patients. And it turns out at a lower dose with food, it's a much more manageable drug. And when all we had was ceritinib, that was something that you figured out with experience. But now that you have multiple drugs available to you, and specifically alectinib in the first-line setting or ceritinib, a drug that you probably have to modify from the get-go and probably thereafter, I think for those reasons, doctors tend to choose alectinib. But it's important to be clear. We do not know that alectinib is better than ceritinib head-to-head. We do not have data to prove that. Now, there are some studies ongoing with other agents like brigatinib, perhaps compared to alectinib. One day we might see, or lorlatinib versus alectinib that one day we might see. But we don't have data to say that alectinib is superior to ceritinib. Ceritinib is a great drug, and I, for a long time, have had patients on ceritinib do quite well, even with managing their dose. I just think because of alectinib's availability, because of its excellent safety profile and ease of management and fantastic CNS control, it's become the kind of easier choice for doctors to make. But ceritinib has a place in the care of patients with ALK lung cancer. It's just that it's hard to know how that fits in now when you're using alectinib first line.